The boutique went silent the moment his hand struck my face. Chandeliers froze, heels stopped mid-click, and every eye turned toward me, a man they decided didn't belong. The manager, Daniel Price, sneered at my sweater, my shoes, my skin, and said I wasn't good enough for his store. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was who I really was. And before the night ended, that silence they used to humiliate me would become the proof that destroyed them. The slap landed before anyone could breathe. Daniel Price's palm cracked against Malcolm Reed's cheek, and the boutique folded into silence. Chandeliers glittered overhead but gave no comfort. The faint jazz that had been filling the space seemed suddenly ashamed of itself. Perfume, once heavy and sweet, hung in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. Malcolm didn't lift a hand to his face. He didn't flinch. His stillness unsettled the room more than the violence had. Daniel adjusted his cuffs, his jaw tight, his tie knotted perfectly, his polished shoes planted like he owned the ground beneath them. "We have standards here," he declared, loud enough for the entire boutique to hear. "And you don't meet them." Eyes turned. A woman in pearls froze mid-gesture, perfume bottle hovering inches from her wrist. A young couple near the register pretended to browse a wallet, though their eyes flicked sideways. At the scarf counter, Claire Saunders gripped folded silks until her knuckles whitened. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she thought better of it. Daniel's gaze ran over Malcolm's gray sweater, plain jeans, sneakers too simple for the glossy marble beneath them. His smirk deepened. "You hear me? Touch anything else and I'll have you removed." Removed. Not asked to leave. Not escorted politely. Removed, as though he were dirt swept in from the street. Malcolm stood quietly, his mocha-toned face marked with the faint blush of the blow. His breathing was steady, even the kind of measured control that carried more weight than words. His eyes drifted not to Daniel but to the navy silk dress swaying faintly on its hanger, still trembling from the force of Daniel's hand knocking his away. The fabric shimmered under the lights, beautiful but suddenly diminished by the ugliness around it. At the door, Officer Reynolds shifted uneasily. The older guard's boots squeaked against the polished floor, his hand brushing his belt not in threat but in doubt. He watched Daniel, then Malcolm, his body torn between command and conscience. Behind Malcolm, whispers rippled. "Why was he even allowed in here?" one woman muttered. Another answered, "God, I hope they throw him out." Daniel's lips twitched with satisfaction. He straightened, feeding on their agreement. "Answer me," he snapped, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Malcolm's eyes finally met his. His voice, when it came, was calm, unshaken. "I'll leave." The smirk returned to Daniel's face, smug and swift. "Good. See that you do." But Malcolm's feet didn't move. His voice carried again, low but clear. "I'd like my receipt." Daniel blinked. "Receipt?" "Yes," Malcolm said evenly. "For the treatment I received here today. If you record incidents, I want mine documented. If you don't, I want your policy in writing saying so." The air shifted. The boutique's hush deepened. Claire startled, fumbling beneath the counter before pulling out a thin slip of paper. Her fingers trembled as she slid it across the glass. Their eyes met briefly. She looked frightened, but beneath the fear, something flickered. Embarrassment. Maybe shame. Malcolm took the slip and folded it once. His hand brushed the weight of a black fountain pen in his pocket, heavy, old, a gift from long ago. He didn't draw it out, but the feel of it anchored him. His mother's words still lived there. "Keep a pen close. Words written down will always outlast words shouted in your face." Daniel waved a hand toward the door, dismissive. "Out. Now. And don't come back." Malcolm's gaze lingered on Officer Reynolds. The guard's jaw flexed. His eyes flickered. A man balancing on a line between orders and integrity. He didn't move. Not yet. Malcolm turned finally, slow and deliberate. His steps pressed into the carpet like ink strokes across a ledger. Above him, the chandeliers glimmered again, but the light felt altered, less brilliant, more ashamed. At the door, his hand closed on the cool metal handle. Behind him, the silence lingered, broken only by the shuffle of expensive shoes, the faint hum of jazz daring to resume. He didn't look back. He didn't give Daniel Price the satisfaction of seeing his face again. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The city's noise greeted him like an embrace, horns blaring, A bus sighing at the curb, a bicycle bell chiming sharp against the air. The afternoon smelled of hot asphalt and coffee drifting from the CF down the block. Out here, no one knew what had just happened. Out here, Malcolm Reed was just another man in a sweater walking down the street. But inside him the silence remained. Silence forged in humiliation doesn't fade quickly. It presses against ribs, echoes through blood, makes a man replay the moment until the bruise isn't just on his cheek but deep in his chest. He touched the folded receipt in his pocket, the paper thin but heavier than gold. Proof. That's what it was now. Proof that something had happened. Proof that Daniel Price had let arrogance write a check against another man's dignity. Proof that Claire Saunders had frozen, ashamed but voiceless. Proof that Officer Reynolds had seen, had hesitated, had not yet acted. Malcolm walked on. Not away. Not defeated. But towards something inevitable. Because some walls must be shaken twice before they remember who built the foundation beneath them. Outside the boutique, the sunlight was sharp and indifferent. Malcolm Reed stood still for a moment, the city's ordinary chaos rushing around him. A delivery truck hissed as it braked at the curb, cyclists dodged between yellow cabs, and the aroma of roasted peanuts from a vendor cart drifted across the sidewalk. Strangers passed without a glance, their lives unbroken, their errands unchanged. The slap on his cheek burned less now, but the weight of silence inside him hadn't eased. He moved toward a stone bench across from the boutique, the kind of bench meant more for decoration than rest. He sat, posture straight, his gaze fixed on the glass façade across the street. Behind the glossy windows, headless mannequins twirled in frozen elegance, draped in silk and sequins that sparkled beneath warm lighting. They belonged. He and Daniel Price's eyes never could. Malcolm slipped a small notebook from his pocket. The cover was worn, the edges curled from use. He opened it to a page lined with neat boxes and handwritten notes. It wasn't a diary. It was an audit log, his own way of recording the places where dignity was measured and too often withheld. Today he added a line. Customer approached within 15 seconds? No. Customer offered assistance? No. Customer treated with dignity? No. He ticked the boxes, his pen steady even as his chest felt tight. His fingers brushed the pen itself, a black fountain pen heavy with memory. It had been a gift from his father on the day Malcolm signed his first major contract. His father's words lingered. Ink is permanent. Use it to write things that matter. Today mattered. Today needed to be written down. Across the street, inside the boutique, the scene looked unchanged. Daniel Price had returned to his post behind the counter, tall and smug. Claire Saunders was folding scarves again, though her hands moved more quickly now, too quickly. And at the door, Officer Reynolds still stood in place, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the street as though trying to catch sight of Malcolm without being caught doing so. Malcolm exhaled slowly. The world wanted him to walk away, to let the moment sink into memory like a bruise fading beneath the skin. But bruises don't heal by being ignored. They heal by pressure, by care, by acknowledgement. He thought of his mother again, her voice soft but steady when she told him as a child that the world would not always be fair, but he could be. He had carried that lesson into boardrooms, into negotiations, into every deal that bore his name. Fairness wasn't something given, it was something you insisted on. He closed the notebook, slid it back into his pocket and stood. His reflection in the boutique window caught his eye. The glass showed a man in a plain gray sweater, jeans and sneakers, his face calm but lined with quiet power. Beside that reflection, a mannequin in emerald silk glittered without shame. The contrast cut him, but it also steeled him. From the bench to the curb, his steps were slow, deliberate. He crossed the street with the poise of someone who had no intention of shrinking. The slap had been meant to humiliate him, to make him smaller. Instead, it carved a path. Inside the boutique, the faint chime of the door startled the silence into trembling once more. Customers glanced up, startled to see him return so soon. Daniel's smirk faltered, confusion flashing across his face before arrogance reclaimed it. You again. Daniel's voice rose, pitched with disbelief. I told you to leave. Malcolm's tone was steady, his eyes locked onto the manager's. I want to see your written policy on incident reports. The room stilled. Claire's hands froze mid-fold. Officer Reynolds straightened, his brows lifting just slightly. Daniel scoffed, but the sound lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Policy? He repeated, mocking. You want paperwork? Yes. Malcolm's voice cut through the air like a clean line of ink across a page. If staff are permitted to strike customers, I want to see where that's written. If not, then I want your process for recording what just occurred. A woman browsing near the handbag shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to Daniel. Another customer cleared his throat and stepped back, pretending to examine sunglasses he had no interest in. Daniel's face flushed, his hands tightening against the counter. We reserve the right to remove anyone disrupting the store, he said stiffly. And I reserve the right to see the words you're hiding behind, Malcolm replied. For a moment the manager faltered. Then reluctantly he gestured toward Claire. Show him. Her hands trembled as she slid a laminated card from beneath the counter. She placed it on the glass, her eyes meeting Malcolm's for only a second before dropping again. He read the words slowly, deliberately, not to waste time but to claim it. The policy spoke of safety, of protecting merchandise, of ensuring the shopping environment remained secure. It said nothing about hands raised in arrogance. Malcolm nodded once. Thank you, he told Claire. His voice carried weight, not anger but acknowledgement. Her shoulders loosened, if only slightly. Daniel tapped his fingers against the marble. Satisfied. Malcolm met his eyes unblinking. Not yet. The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel's jaw flexed. Behind him a customer slipped quietly toward the door, unwilling to stand in a room that felt like it was holding its breath again. Officer Reynolds finally stepped forward. His voice was low, careful. Sir. He addressed Malcolm. Do you need me to call someone? Malcolm's gaze shifted to him. No, he said evenly. You saw what you saw. That's enough. The guard hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. His silence spoke more than words could. Daniel bristled, anger spilling into his features. You're wasting everyone's time. No, Malcolm said softly, his tone like the edge of a blade wrapped in velvet. I'm recording how you use it. He signed the incident slip Claire offered, his fountain pen scratching neatly against the paper. Daniel's eyes flicked to the pen, his expression tightening. It wasn't a cheap tool. It wasn't a casual choice. It was a statement. Malcolm folded the paper, slid it into his pocket, and turned toward the door once more. His departure was not hurried, not fearful. It was deliberate, the walk of a man who owned his steps. Outside, the city's noise swallowed him again. But something had shifted now, subtle but undeniable. Inside the boutique, Claire's hands shook as she returned to her scarves. Officer Reynolds stared after Malcolm, the weight of conscience heavy in his chest. And Daniel Price, though still standing tall behind his counter, could not shake the faint quiver in his fingers. On the stone bench across the street, Malcolm sat once more, his reflection in the glass still staring back at him. He opened his notebook again, added a new line beneath the boxes already ticked. Policy shown, yes. Dignity upheld, no. He drew the pen across the page with quiet precision. The city moved around him unbothered. But for Malcolm Reed this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Some insults cut too deep to fade with time. Some wounds demanded not revenge but repair. And repair, he knew, begins with truth. He closed the notebook, placed the pen gently across it, and leaned back against the bench. His eyes remained on the boutique's windows, on the mannequins that stood perfect and silent behind the glass. They looked flawless, but they would never know the sting of being told they didn't belong. Humans did. And that was the weight Malcolm carried with him now, heavy but unyielding. The evening light had softened by the time Malcolm Reed stood again. He had remained across the street, notebook closed in his lap, watching as customers trickled in and out of the boutique. Each one passed through the same doors where Daniel Price's voice had rung with arrogance hours earlier. Each one was greeted by the same strained smile from Claire Saunders, her gesture stilted, her laughter too thin. Each one walked past Officer Reynolds, who lingered near the entrance like a man with something caught in his throat. The slap itself had faded to a memory on Malcolm's cheek, but the weight of silence lingered, heavier than before. He hadn't returned for spectacle. He hadn't returned for anger. He returned because the wound wasn't just personal, it was structural, carved into the marble tiles and gold trim of the boutique itself. He rose, slid the pen back into his pocket, and crossed the street once more. His stride was measured, deliberate. The boutique door chimed when he pushed it open, the sound crisp and unmistakable. Heads turned. Conversations thinned into whispers. Daniel Price looked up from behind the counter. His posture stiffened. For a moment surprise flickered across his face, but he buried it quickly beneath disdain. "You again," he said, voice rising. "I told you not to come back." Malcolm didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the boutique slowly, taking in the mannequins draped in sequins, the polished marble floors, the walls of handbags gleaming beneath soft lights. His eyes lingered on Claire, who had stopped folding scarves mid-motion. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. Then his gaze moved to Officer Reynolds, whose hand twitched near his radio but didn't lift it. Finally, Malcolm's eyes settled back on Daniel. His voice was calm, almost soft. "I want to speak to whoever is above you." The air shifted. Customers glanced at one another, unsure if they should keep browsing or step away. Claire's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Reynolds shifted again, his weight rocking between boots. Daniel laughed, sharp and brittle. "Above me? This is my store." He leaned across the counter, his smirk returning. "If you're looking for charity, you won't find it here. If you're looking for trouble, you've already had your share." Malcolm didn't blink. "I'm not asking." The words fell heavy, pressing against the marble floor, against the glass chandeliers, against the air itself. Claire set the scarves down carefully, her fingers trembling. A woman browsing near the handbags cleared her throat, uncomfortable. Even the music seemed to falter, the soft piano notes sounding out of place. Daniel straightened, his voice cutting. "You have no authority here." Malcolm stepped closer, his tone steady, unhurried. "And yet, I'm still standing here." The silence that followed was different from the one born of shock earlier that day. This silence was heavier, layered with tension, with shame, with unease. It wasn't just Malcolm against Daniel anymore. It was Malcolm against a culture everyone could feel but no one wanted to name. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Sir," he addressed Malcolm, "if you're asking for corporate, I can dash." Daniel's hand shot up, silencing the guard. "Don't," he snapped. "This man is wasting our time." But Reynolds didn't step back. His jaw flexed. His eyes lingered on Malcolm, then flicked back to Daniel. For the first time, his loyalty wavered in plain sight. Malcolm's gaze softened, not with weakness but with clarity. He turned toward Claire. "What's your manager's name above Daniel Price?" Her lips trembled. For a second she didn't answer. But then, too quietly for Daniel to stop her in time, she whispered, "Regional Director. Ms. Lowell." Daniel's face flushed. "Claire," he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut. That's none of his dash, but Malcolm's attention had already shifted back to him. "Thank you," he told Claire. His calm acknowledgement only deepened her shame and her relief at once. Daniel's hand slammed against the counter. The sound cracked through the boutique like glass breaking. "You're finished here," he hissed. "Do you understand me? Finished." Malcolm didn't flinch. He slipped the folded receipt from his pocket, held it up between two fingers, and let the silence carry it. The paper was thin, almost weightless, but it gleamed under the chandeliers like evidence under interrogation lights. "You already wrote me into your system," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "And now I'll write you into mine." For a moment Daniel faltered. The arrogance in his smirk wavered, replaced by something flickering just behind his eyes. Fear perhaps. Or recognition. Reynolds shifted again, his hand no longer near his radio but resting lightly against his belt. He looked between the two men, his expression conflicted. Claire's hand shook as she gathered the scarves again, but her eyes kept drifting to Malcolm, drawn to the steadiness in his gaze. A young man near the cologne display whispered to his companion, "He's not backing down." His voice carried more awe than judgment. Malcolm folded the receipt once more and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned for the door, his steps calm, unhurried, deliberate. At the threshold he paused. His hand rested on the glass handle, but his eyes lingered on Daniel. "You think this ends at the door?" Malcolm said softly, almost too softly. But the room heard it. The words pressed into the marble, into the air, into Daniel's chest. It doesn't. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the street. The city met him again with noise, horns, footsteps, a dog barking down the block. The air smelled of coffee and exhaust. Life moved on indifferent. But Malcolm's steps carried weight. His notebook pressed against his pocket. His pen rested heavy against his side. And the boutique behind him was no longer simply a store. It was a wound that needed repair. Inside, Daniel leaned heavily against the counter, his breath shallow, his face pale beneath the flush of anger. He muttered something under his breath, but the words didn't carry. Claire stood frozen, her eyes on the door where Malcolm had just exited. Reynolds stared after him too, his brow furrowed, his jaw working like a man who had tasted truth and wasn't sure what to do with it. For Malcolm, the humiliation was no longer the story. The story was the structure that allowed it, the culture that protected it, and the silence that enabled it. And he knew now that silence was the most dangerous of them all. As he walked down the block, notebook still tucked safely away, he thought not of the slap, not of the sting on his cheek. He thought of the way Daniel Price's voice had cracked when authority began to slip. He thought of Claire Saunders' trembling whisper of the name Ms. Lowell. He thought of Officer Reynolds's hesitation, his quiet attempt to intervene. These were the cracks. Small, fragile, but visible. And Malcolm Reed knew well enough that structures collapse not all at once, but through cracks that spread until the weight becomes too much. He stopped at the corner, leaned briefly against a lamppost, and pulled the notebook from his pocket again. The pen slid easily into his hand, familiar, weighted. He opened to a fresh page and wrote a single line. Second entry. Culture resisted truth. Cracks forming. He capped the pen with deliberate care and slid the notebook back into his pocket. When he lifted his eyes again, the boutique stood in the distance, lit warm and golden against the fading day. But behind the glass it looked colder than it ever had. Malcolm straightened his shoulders, took a slow breath, and turned up the street. This was no longer about a slap. It was about dignity, about repair, about truth. And truth, he knew, was only just beginning to speak. The boutique glowed against the falling dusk, its windows lit golden as if warmth could erase the chill of what had happened inside. Malcolm Reed walked slowly up the street, his shoulders square, his stride steady but his thoughts heavy. The notebook pressed against his pocket with every step, its pages already carrying today's truth in careful ink. By the time he reached the corner SAF, the weight in his chest had settled into something sharper. He ordered nothing, simply stepped inside long enough to sit at a table near the window, a clear view of the boutique across the street. He rested the notebook on the table, pen poised above a blank page. His reflection merged with the boutique's glow behind the glass, man and marble, flesh and illusion. He began to write. Second entry. Culture resisted. Silence held. Cracks forming. He paused, then added, names. Daniel Price, Claire Saunders, Officer Reynolds. Regional Director Ms. Lowell. He underlined the last name, slow and deliberate. Malcolm's hand stilled. He wasn't just collecting incidents now. He was building a record that demanded accountability. And accountability always traveled upward. Inside the boutique, Daniel moved restlessly, pacing behind the counter, his composure eroding with each turn. Claire folded scarves with mechanical precision, her eyes down, but every few seconds her gaze flickered toward the door, toward the glass, toward the possibility of Malcolm's return. Reynolds leaned near the entrance, his posture more rigid than before, his conscience weighing heavier. When the boutique clock struck 7, the door opened again, not with the hush of hesitant customers, but with the confident stride of someone whose presence demanded recognition. Margaret Lowell, Regional Director, entered in a navy trench coat, her heels sharp against the marble floor. She carried no shopping bag, no purse, only a slim leather folio tucked beneath her arm. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, her expression cool but assessing. Daniel straightened immediately, relief washing across his face before smugness reclaimed it. Miss Lowell, he greeted, voice too eager, too quick. I'm glad you came. We've had a disruption today. Margaret's hand rose, silencing him before the words could finish. She looked around the boutique, her eyes sharp as glass, taking in the space, the staff, the uneasy atmosphere that clung to the marble like static. Her gaze landed briefly on Claire, then on Reynolds before finally returning to Daniel. "Explain," she said simply. Daniel launched into a polished retelling, his voice smooth, his words carefully chosen. He came in dressed. Well, not appropriately. Tried to handle merchandise beyond his means. Became confrontational when I asked him to leave. I did what was necessary to maintain the standards of the store. Margaret listened without expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Did you strike him?" Daniel's confidence faltered. His mouth opened then closed again. He was reaching aggressively. I had to prevent Dash. "Did you strike him?" she repeated, her tone firmer now, steel beneath the calm. Silence stretched. Claire's hands froze on the fabric she held. Reynolds's jaw tightened. Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes," he admitted finally. But Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And the policy allows that?" Daniel stammered, words tangling in his throat. "For disruptions, for safety - Does the policy," she cut in, her voice sharp, "allow that?" Daniel's face flushed crimson. His gaze darted toward Claire. Then Reynolds, searching for silent support, but found none. Margaret lowered her folio to the counter and opened it with practiced precision. Inside were neatly stacked documents. Incident reports, complaint logs, employee statements. She slid a sheet free and placed it on the marble, tapping the top corner. "This store has received 5 complaints in the last quarter alone. Each mentions profiling. Each mentions hostility from management. Do you recognize your name here, Mr. Price?" Daniel's throat worked, but no words came. Claire's breath caught. Reynolds shifted, his boots squeaking faintly. "Your arrogance doesn't just reflect on you," Margaret continued. "It reflects on the brand, on every employee here, on me." She leaned closer, her eyes locking onto his. "And now, thanks to your judgment, it reflects on a man you chose to humiliate in front of strangers." Daniel's hands clenched against the counter. "He was no one," he snapped, desperation breaking through. "He was dressed like - Margaret's voice sliced through his excuse. "He is Malcolm Reed." The name landed like a stone in a still pond. Claire's eyes widened. Reynolds straightened. Even the customers still lingering in the boutique turned their heads. Curiosity ignited. Daniel blinked, his mouth hanging open. "What?" Margaret's gaze didn't soften. "Malcolm Reed. Investor. Owner of multiple properties. A man whose name carries weight in circles you'll never step foot in." Daniel staggered back a step, the color draining from his face. His lips parted but no sound emerged. Claire's scarf slipped from her trembling hands. Reynolds exhaled, long and low. His earlier hesitation replaced with a kind of clarity. Margaret closed the folio with a snap. "You struck him. You belittled him. And worse, you did it because you believed you could. That arrogance is poison, and I will not have it under my watch." Daniel's voice returned at last, brittle and frantic. "He didn't say who he was. He didn't tell us - Margaret's eyes narrowed. "He shouldn't have to." The words rang through the boutique, heavier than any slap, sharper than any insult. Customers glanced at one another, some nodding faintly, others shifting uncomfortably. Claire's eyes filled, shame burning her cheeks. She bent quickly to pick up the fallen scarf, but her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it again. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "He was calm," the guard said. "Never raised his voice. Never caused harm. We all saw it." Margaret's gaze shifted briefly to him, a flicker of acknowledgement passing in her eyes, before returning to Daniel. "You will prepare your resignation. Effective immediately." Daniel's mouth opened, desperate. "Please, Ms. Lowell," her hand lifted again, final this time. "Enough." Silence followed, heavier than the chandeliers above, heavier than the perfume clinging to the air. Outside, across the street, Malcolm still sat in the CAF. Through the window, he could see the faint blur of movement inside, the way Daniel's posture sagged, the way Margaret's presence filled the boutique like a verdict. He didn't need to hear the words to know their weight. He closed his notebook, slid the pen across the leather cover, and leaned back in his chair. The sting on his cheek was long gone. What remained was something else, something deeper. Vindication, perhaps. Or simply the quiet satisfaction of truth beginning to find its voice. Back inside, Margaret turned to Claire. "Go home for the evening," she said gently. "You've seen enough." Claire's lips trembled. "Ms. Lowell." She paused, swallowed hard, then whispered, "I should have spoken sooner." Margaret's eyes softened just slightly. "Then speak tomorrow. In writing." Claire nodded quickly, tears brimming as she gathered her things. Reynolds offered her a faint, steady glance as she passed, his silence carrying something like solidarity. Daniel stood frozen behind the counter, pale and sweating, his world collapsing in on itself. Margaret gathered her folio, her heels clicking against the marble as she turned toward the door. At the threshold she paused, her voice carrying one last weight. "This store doesn't just sell clothes," she said. "It sells dignity. And tonight it failed." Then she stepped out, the door chiming softly behind her. Night settled over the city, wrapping the streets in amber streetlight and restless traffic. The boutique, still glowing behind its glass façade, looked smaller now, as if the weight of what had happened inside pressed against its walls, dimming its shine. Inside, Daniel Price sat hunched behind the counter, his tie loosened, his forehead damp. His authority had drained out of him like water through a crack. Claire Saunders had left, her absence echoing more loudly than her presence ever had. Officer Reynolds remained by the door, his stance weary, his eyes haunted by the memory of silence he hadn't broken. Margaret Lowell's footsteps still lingered in the marble, sharp reminders that power could descend without warning, that arrogance had limits. But the air inside the boutique remained heavy, unsteady, as though waiting for something more. Across the street, Malcolm Reed rose from his seat at the CF. He slipped his notebook back into his pocket, capped his fountain pen, and stepped into the cool night air. His stride was unhurried, his shoulders steady, but each step carried the weight of what had come before. He crossed the street slowly, his reflection merging with the boutique's glass doors before he pushed them open one final time. The chime rang out, thin and brittle. Daniel's head jerked up. Reynolds stiffened. The few customers who remained turned toward the door, their conversations faltering into silence. Malcolm entered quietly, but the space seemed to bow to him all the same. His presence wasn't loud. It was steadiness itself, a calm gravity that pulled every gaze. He stopped in the center of the boutique, beneath the chandeliers that sparkled nervously above. His eyes swept the room, not hurried, not searching but deliberate, as if memorizing every face, every shadow. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself upright. "Mr. Reed," he said, the name foreign and sharp in his mouth. I didn't know." Malcolm's gaze cut to him, not cruel, not forgiving. "Just steady. You didn't need to know." The words landed heavier than a shout. Daniel flinched, his mouth opening again, but no sound followed. Malcolm turned his attention to Reynolds. The guard's hand twitched against his belt, his jaw tight. Their eyes met, and Malcolm gave a single nod. "You saw," he said quietly. Reynolds exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. "I did," he admitted, voice rough with the weight of truth finally spoken. Malcolm's gaze moved next to the counter, where Claire's folded scarves remained neatly stacked, her absence a presence of its own. He let the silence hold, giving weight to what she had failed to say earlier, what she might still say tomorrow. Then finally he turned back to Daniel. "This store doesn't belong to marble," Malcolm said, his voice even but carrying through every corner. "It doesn't belong to chandeliers or silk dresses or polished shoes. It belongs to the people who walk through those doors, every one of them. And tonight you showed them something ugly. You showed them arrogance dressed as authority. You showed them cruelty dressed as standards." Daniel's hands trembled against the counter. "It wasn't don't," Malcolm said softly, but the words silenced him more effectively than any shout. "Don't defend what you know you can't." The customers who remained stood still, some with arms crossed, others with eyes lowered, each caught in the gravity of the moment. Reynolds looked down at his boots, shame flickering across his face. Malcolm stepped closer to the counter. He drew the folded receipt from his pocket and placed it gently on the marble. The paper looked fragile under the lights, but it carried the weight of everything that had transpired. He laid his fountain pen beside it, the black resin glinting faintly. "This," he said, tapping the paper once, "is proof. Proof of what was done. Proof of what was said. Proof that silence isn't emptiness, it's record. And silence," his eyes lifted, locking onto Daniel, "can be louder than arrogance." Daniel's breath quickened. His lips parted, but no defense came. Malcolm straightened, his voice softening but not losing its weight. "Dignity is not a standard you apply when someone looks the way you expect. It's not a privilege you grant to those who meet your measure. It's the foundation. Without it, this place is just glass and fabric." The chandeliers above shimmered faintly, casting fractured light across the marble. Reynolds shifted again, his face heavy with the truth of what he had witnessed. The customers looked at Malcolm now with something different, not pity, not curiosity, but respect. Malcolm picked up his pen once more, sliding it back into his pocket. The receipt remained on the counter, a fragile monument to the night. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the boutique one final time. "I didn't come here to belong," he said. "I came here to remind you what belonging should mean." He walked toward the door, his steps quiet but deliberate. At the threshold he paused, his hand resting on the glass handle. Without turning back, he added, "I'll be watching." Then he stepped into the night. The door closed softly behind him, but the silence he left behind pressed into every corner of the boutique. Daniel sank against the counter, his face pale, his hands trembling. Reynolds stood frozen by the door, his conscience heavy, his respect for Malcolm unspoken but undeniable. The customers dispersed slowly, their eyes wide, their conversations hushed. Outside, Malcolm walked beneath the amber streetlights, the night cool against his skin. The sting of the slap was long gone, but its echo had transformed. What had begun as humiliation had become testimony. What had begun as silence had become proof. He reached into his pocket and touched the notebook, its cover worn but firm. Inside, his careful ink told the story of the night, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with truth. He knew this was only the beginning. Cracks had formed, structures would shift, and dignity once claimed was not easily forgotten. As he walked into the city's restless hum, Malcolm Reed carried no anger, no triumph, only the calm, steady weight of a man who knew that silence, when wielded with purpose, could be the loudest voice of all. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Hit like to stand with dignity. Share this video so more people remember what respect truly means, and subscribe so you never miss stories that reveal the power of silence over arrogance. But I want to hear from you. If you had been standing in that boutique watching it unfold, would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters.